Today we continue our sermon series over the topic of if you could sit down with God and ask God one question, what would it be? And today we are going to talk about the question of why is there suffering? And for me, this question of why there is suffering is a question that I would ask God. Since an early age in my young life, the question of why we suffer has always been present in my thoughts. And at times that question has consumed me and haunted me. This answer to why there is suffering in the world has constantly changed throughout my life, and it surely will change in the future. Instead, there's one of the requirements in graduating with a master's in divinity degree was to take a class over one of the books in the Old Testament. And we had to limit this selection because it was a smaller seminary. But it was pretty easy for me to choose which book I wanted to study. And that was the book of Job. I imagine, like many of you, I still find the book of Job intriguing and fascinating. Before I took this class over Job, I thought I knew Job. But after completing that class, I found out that I really didn't know him at all. We all know the story of Job. Job was identified as being the most faithful and faith-filled man in the world. So God and Satan had a discussion about whether Job would remain as faithful to God as calamity struck him and if Job suffered in a deep way. Now God's bet was that Job would remain faithful to him. So God releases Job to Satan to test his theory out. Now Job has Satan's mercy to do whatever he pleases, except Satan cannot take Job's life. So Satan has a heyday with Job and causes quite a ruckus. Then he strikes Job's slaves, his animals, and his children dead. The Job's body is taken over with all kinds of nastiness. Sores that ooze out pus, boils. And to say that Job had a lot of horrible things going on is an understatement. Unfortunately, his wife and friends did not really help him. They were either telling him to curse God or pointing out that it was Job's own fault that he was suffering. Job must have done something to deserve his current plight. Now, in the midst of his suffering, Job, he was just very vocal about confronting God and asking him why all that he was experiencing was happening to him instead of to someone who was less faithful than he had been. It takes a while, but God finally appears to Job, and God appears out of a whirlwind. But God provides no easy answers for Job. Really, God provides no answers at all, just more questions. And we don't tend to like it when there are no good answers or reasons pointing to why things are what they are. We simply open up our eyes and we are able to see and know that there's real suffering in the world, and there are different kinds of suffering, from personal suffering and loss to systemic issues to global destruction. We want to believe that life and the world are good and fair, but we all know better than that. But at the same time, we still expect life in the world to be good and fair, because most of the time it is. When there is an argument between two people who are in a relationship with one another, most of the time they are able to move forward in their relationship. When there's a job loss or a cutting of hours at work, most of the time the family unit manages to keep it together. When a child gets sick, most of the time they turn out okay. When a storm hovers over a town, most of the time it doesn't lead to destruction. When we drive a vehicle, most of the time we make it to our destination safely. But there are those times when those situations do not turn out okay. An argument can be what forever severs the ties between two people. A job loss or underemployment for too long can lead to a family not being able to pay their bills or being able to feed their children. A child who gets sick, dies, or is deeply scarred for life. A storm brings destruction and devastation to a people. A car wreck can lead to a person being handicapped or even dying. And it's during those times when we take notice that something is wrong. Something's just not right. Because we live in a modern, scientific, research-oriented world, we have the ability to understand some of the causes why they're suffering. When an adult gets severely sick and eventually dies, sometimes it's because they participated in an unhealthy lifestyle for far too long. When there's a car accident that paralyzes someone or takes a life, it's because the driver of the other car ran at a red light, or the victim fell asleep at the wheel. When there's a wildfire that takes over acres and acres of sacred land, we blame it on the combination of the lack of rain and the setting of an initial fire. A child is born with a life-threatening condition. You can say that something didn't go right while the child was growing in their mother's womb. One out of every 5 children in the world under the age of 5 die because of the lack of safe drinking water. We know it's because the places they live do not have the resources to ensure that the water is safe to drink. However, knowing all of that just doesn't settle our minds, nor does it soothe our souls. Because explaining and finding a reason why the suffering of the world and life happen is so much deeper than the scientific and logical answers and reasons. Those answers and reasons seem so hollow to us. And there's a reason for that. Because they are. And so we turn to God for answers, for reasons. There's this whole category of theological and philosophical thinking that strives to reconcile, on one hand, the reality that we live in an imperfect, evil world filled with suffering, and on the other hand, we have this traditional belief in an omnipotent, all-powerful, and omnipotent, all-controlling type of God. This wave of thought is called theodicy, and it's been around since the beginning of time. The question of why there is suffering has always been something that's been contemplated and pondered. So we ask, what role does God play in a world and a people who suffer so greatly and so deeply? One could prescribe that God has a direct role in natural control suffering. Those who seem to leave this viewpoint with line of thinking would say things such as, God took your loved one because God needed him or her more than you needed them here on earth. There must be a reason why you were suffering. God's probably testing you so that later you can do greater things. God doesn't give us more than what we can't. Now let's continue with our line of reasoning. If God is God who controls suffering, who controls who suffers and who does not, and to what degree, then that God seems like a cruel God, partial and unfair God. And that's the kind of God that I personally refuse to believe. I know this kind of reasoning is comforting for many, because it gives a reason why suffering happens. However, I personally can't reconcile the image of a God who picks and chooses who suffers to a greater degree than others. I can't. And that's not the kind of God that I choose to believe in. When someone loses the